South Korea's Fair Trade Commission has laid plans to review the consumer practices, particularly policies dealing with in-game purchases of game companies. According to the Korean Herald, the FTC announced it aims to extensively review those consumer regulations and has reached out to 10 game companies in the country, including Nexon, Nesoft, Blizzard, and Riot Games, for information on the subject. It's an investigation that comes as more and more governing bodies are starting to pay closer attention to in-game monetization practices, including organizations in the United States. South Korea is ranked as one of the top 5 markets for video games in the world, with a large majority of paying players buying virtual goods, the sale of which could be affected by government regulation. The proposed review would look at clauses related to underage players, in-game purchases, and other policies. The Korean Herald says some companies have policies that require parental approval for teenaged players, limit refunds for in-game purchases, presents, or restrict how a gifted item can be used, and the FTC plans to evaluate the fairness of such practices. A representative from the Commission notes, however, that the goal is not to make refunds easier to obtain. Some news reports suggest that it may become easier for people to get refunds for in-game purchases if they can prove that their children used credit cards without permission. An FTC representative tells the Korean Herald, but if an underage user actively deceives parents, that's on the case. If a minor spends more than the legally allowed amount of $70,001.62 a month, he or she will be held accountable. Liz Schuler, FOCO Secretary-Treasurer, makes her case for the Game Developer Union in the wake of Activision Blizzard's massive layoff wave, a move that was announced in the same call as the company's record quarter. The Union Federation, FOCO, has published an open letter to game developers, urging members of the industry to organize. The FCO itself is the largest labor organization in the United States and counts 55 individual unions and more than 12.5 million workers among its affiliates. The letter, readable in full on Kotaku, calls out many of the issues that have prompted conversations about unionization in just recent years, like excessive crunch, toxic work conditions, inadequate pay, and job instability. The industry, points out FCO's Secretary-Treasurer Liz Schuler, boasted sales 3.6 times greater than those of the film industry in 2018. Yet much of that financial success is not felt by the developers working on the games that generate those billions. Executives are always quick to brag about your work. It's the talk of every industry corner office and boardroom. They pay tribute to the games that capture our imaginations and seem to defy economic gravity. They talk up the latest innovations in virtual reality and celebrate record-smashing releases as your creations reach unparalleled new heights. Says Schuler, my question is this: what have you gotten in return? They get reach. They get notoriety. They get to be crowned visionaries and regarded as pioneers. What do you get? Outrageous hours on inadequate paychecks, stressful, toxic work conditions that push you to your physical and mental limits. The fear that asking for better means risking your dream job. Schuler makes the argument that the change needed by the industry will not happen on its own, and will not come from those at the top of the AAA development food chain. She calls out the work already done by Game Workers Unite, a group that got its start last year with the goal of advocating for a game developers union, and has already become a game developer-focused branch of the IAB Union in the United Kingdom. as evidence that game developers can embrace the power of solidarity, and prove that you do not have to accept a broken, twisted status quo. Change will happen when you gain leverage by joining together in a strong union, says Shooter, and it will happen when you use your collective voice to bargain for a fair share of the wealth you create every day, no matter where you work. Bosses will only offer fair treatment when you stand together and demand it. Hoedown is a premium-priced mobile brick breaker built upon the joy found in a single moment in the genre, the time when the ball sneaks behind the blocks and just goes wild, bashing away at them as the player watches. It's a game that encourages players get their ball bouncing between blocks as often as possible, savoring the chaos as the balls slam about. Gamasutra spoke with Martin Grapefruit Johnson, developer of Hoedown as well as other finely made indie games like Twofold Incorporated and Dream Capsule, to talk about how the appeal of this moment shaped the game's play style, how the game's design helps the player find order and strategy within those wild bounces, and designing stages that would make this kind of moment happen often. In Johnson's words, per usual, it's a mishmash of ideas from all over. But the initial seed came from playing another game that uses a similar mechanic. Aim a stream of balls at a bunch of blocks, break them, do it again. That particular game felt like a missed opportunity, so I quickly threw together my own prototype to try out some ideas I had. There's this mysterious, universal appeal to watching a bunch of balls bounce around that just made it work really well. Basically, it became about distilling that bit in more traditional brick breakers, i.e. breakout, where you sneak a ball in above all the bricks, and it just goes wild. I cannot claim to really understand it, but the bouncing is hypnotic. With Hoedown, it became a challenge to balance the inherent chaos of 50. I saw balls bouncing around with some type of order and hierarchy to what was and was not important. There's a lot going on once the bouncing starts, so I was fairly restrictive with effects and such, mostly using them to convey important changes on events. This is related to the layout of the generation of levels. I realized it would be a good incentive for deep shots if the blocks actually rested on each other. So removing blocks lower in the playfield would make it messy. This basically required the game to have you shoot down. I did try upside down gravity along with shooting up, because that configuration is less prone to the common mobile issue of hiding the thing you are aiming at with your finger. However, that upside down mode was incredibly confusing, so firing down it was. The stages are all procedurally generated, but somehow, I got quite lucky with the way they are generated and ended up with a setup that was easy to tweak to make levels that strike a good balance between difficulty and fun shots. Early in prototyping, it became obvious that the most fun shots were when you managed to get your balls in a small pocket and they de-bounce around wildly. These types of setups were originally somewhat rare to happen upon, but once I realized I could do the rounded corners, it all fell into place. They open up the playfield much more, and in combination with the larger Tetrimino-style blocks, it just works really well. Looks nice too. That balance is all down to tweaking the way the levels are generated. Luckily, I have many knots I can tweak for that. I can adjust how many blocks are filled, how big the blocks are, how many blocks are stuck in the wall, and perhaps most importantly, their hit points. All of these things were adjusted over months of testing alongside working on the game. Early on, I had an idea that the player would amass diamonds as they were digging, just like now. But instead of keeping them all as the round ends, you dilute them unless you build a little savior work. I had these checkpoints every so often where you could opt to escape to the surface. But no one ever did. They just wanted to keep digging. I tried adjusting things, but could never get it to really feel like an interesting choice. It either felt like digging was the best option, or it just felt overly mean. I did not like having to cut that idea. I somehow still really like it. But in the end, it did not work no matter how much of a darling it was. This game was the first time I worked with a concept artist. The original plan was to try to take the visuals away from my comfortable old style and somewhere mood